What is up, you guys? In today's video, we're going to be setting up a nano moss terrarium. So the items I'll be using in this terrarium are, of course, some stones. They're going to be my drainage layer. I got some broken up bits of slate. And of course, I got some potting soil. And the plants I'll be using are Fittonia. These do great in small terrariums as they stay relatively small. And I have a reasonable sized assortment of various mosses, which will also be the main bulk of this terrarium. And honestly, moss is a very easy thing to come across if you know where to look. You can pretty much just go for a bushwalk and find moss. It's basically how I found most of mine. I found most of this moss either growing on the sides of rocks or growing on the ground. When I found it, it was very dry because we're in our summer, but as soon as you rehydrate it and as soon as it gets wet, very quickly, usually within minutes, it starts fluffing up again and looking lush and green. You can also propagate it at home and grow it at home quite easily too. So once you harvest some from outside, you can grow your own. So first step, I'm just adding my stones. This is pretty much my drainage layer to my terrarium. Because you don't want the soil to be sitting in water, you want to add that drainage layer. Normally what you would want to do is cut a sheet of fly screen and put it over the drainage layer so it separates that from the soil. Unfortunately, when I was already started making this video, I kind of just noticed I'm actually out of fly screen. So this particular terrarium we're doing without the fly screen. It is better to do it with it, but it's not 100% necessary. It just is a bit better. So as you can see, I'm laying my slate down because the design for this terrarium is actually to make a stone staircase surrounded by moss and plants. So you want to lay your slate down as flat as possible, starting with the biggest piece, moving up to the smallest. And of course, you fill in the gaps around the edges with your soil as you go, and fill in the gaps behind the slate as you put a step down so your structure doesn't fall backwards. FYI, a paintbrush is a really handy tool to use when doing this, especially if you're helping to keep the soil out of certain places, like off your stone steps, for example, where you can just use a little paintbrush to dust it off as you go. So as you can see, this is kind of a fiddly, tedious sort of a thing, just going one step at a time with the rocks, filling in a little bit of soil each time you put a new rock in. So it is a bit tedious, but I guess if you enjoy this sort of thing like I do, I guess it's not tedious, but each their own, I suppose there. So I'm wetting the soil as I go, just to make that soil a little bit more pliable, because now I've got to dig little holes and put my Fittonia plants in. So these plants are a great terrarium plant. They don't get massive, they stay small with small leaves, so they stay within proportion of what I'm trying to create here, which is like a micro habitat. So next what you want to do is just get a pair of scissors and cut off whatever section of moss you feel like you need to fit into your space. The beauty of the moss is you don't have to plant it like a plant. You don't have to dig a hole for it. You can literally just sit it where you want it to be, and that's it. Just sit it on top of the soil, or even on top of the rock if you want to sit it on a rock or on a piece of wood, and it's perfectly fine like that. Moss doesn't have roots like plants. They basically absorb water via evaporation and condensation. so they don't need to have roots embedded into the soil like a plant does. So you just cut whatever size piece you want and sit it wherever you want in the terrarium. As long as your terrarium maintains a constant humidity and moisture level, the moss will always do really well. So one thing you do have to remember when setting up any little glass terrarium like this, it does have to have a lid. Whether it be a glass lid like my one has here, or just a plastic lid. If you're making a terrarium out of like a jar, they usually come with a lid. And the idea is you mist your terrarium ever so lightly, screw the lid on, sit it somewhere where it gets bright light, or like I've done, I've actually got an actual LED light on this terrarium to just enhance the growth of the plants and moss a bit more than if I didn't have it there, I guess. But if you don't want to go that extra mile, you can just sit it somewhere where it gets bright light, but not direct sunlight, just bright indirect light, and then it'll grow quite well. And the idea is as the water evaporates, you get condensation from that water on the glass and on the lid. It eventually just falls back down into the terrarium, and it's a constant cycle. Eventually the water will evaporate away, but it takes a very, very long time. So realistically, you could just give your terrarium a very light mist once a month or once every 2 months, and that's pretty much all you got to do for them. Aside from the fact that you just have to sit it somewhere where it gets reasonably bright light without direct sun, or you can just do what I've done and put a little LED light above it. That kind of makes it look a lot more eye-catching because it's just so much more brighter and visible. So you will also want to take one other little thing into consideration if you're going to take moss out of the bush as opposed to, say, growing it yourself. When you take moss from outside, you need to use RODI water or distilled water, because moss can't handle any minerals in the water, any TDS levels, any sodium, any of that stuff. Because as I was saying, when moss is growing in the wild, they're living off basically rainwater which collects on them and condensation from water evaporating. And that water doesn't have any minerals in it. And on top of the fact that moss also grows on either the sides of rocks or on the sides of trees and fallen logs, these things don't really have any like TDS reading in the water that collects on that, because it's just rainwater. And on the mosses that I found growing on the ground, they've been growing on sand, not so much soil. Now moss can grow in soil, but it'd be soil that just doesn't hold a TDS reading. So you really do need to use RODI water for your moss. If you give it water straight from the tap water does have a TDS reading of, well, it varies from where you live, I suppose. My tap water has a reading of around 300 ppm, which is quite low, but it's still enough to upset moss. Generally, moss doesn't grow that well, even with that low level of total dissolved solids, or sodium, to put it simply. So if you can get access to RODI water, distilled water, you can buy it from the shops. Yeah, otherwise, if you can't do that, the other option is just use rainwater. So when it rains, just put a container out to collect some rainwater and go from there. You can just use that for your moss. One other thing to just keep an eye on is overwatering. So the way to tell if your terrarium has or hasn't been overwatered is by how much condensation is on your glass. A little bit of condensation throughout the day, like a few patches of condensated water, is fine, or just a little bit of condensation in the morning and afternoon, that's usually okay. But if your terrarium is just fully covered in condensation all day long, that usually means you've overwatered. So you might want to just wipe that water off the glass every day until the amount of condensation is reduced by removing that water manually via wiping it off the glass. One of the things I absolutely love about these nano terrariums is they can be incredibly cheap to make, because realistically you can find most of your materials outside. You can get your rocks from outside, bits of wood from outside, and of course your moss. And this is honestly something I would like to start doing more regularly on my channel, as well as the reptile videos and the more stock standard houseplant videos. I want to make a few of these little nano terrariums from time to time as well, just so my channel has a little bit of variety on it. But anyways guys, I'm out of here. If you've enjoyed this video, Don't forget to leave a like, Instagram's down below, bing the notification bell so you know when I put new videos up. But until then, I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye.